Bom dia, é um prazer recebê-los de volta essa quinta-feira para a penúltima aula do curso. Good morning, it's great to have you back this Thursday for the 12th class in this course. Today we're very happy to welcome Bashir Bashir. His primary research interests are nationalism and citizenship. He also dedicates his research to liberalism, democratic theory, decolonization. Among other numerous publications, he's the co-editor of The Holocaust and the Nakba, a new grammar of trauma and history that was edited by Columbia University Press, and also The Arab and Jewish Questions, Geographies of Engagement in Palestine and Beyond. For the Brazilian students here at the University of São Paulo, I have ordered these books. I have asked our library to order these books, which, by the way, are very interesting, to put the Holocaust and the Nakba together, not as equal phenomena, but as phenomena that are linked to each other in several ways, which his book analyzes. So it's a pleasure to have and to host and to welcome Bashir Bashir, and we thank you very much for this class, which will be on the ideas, projects, and discussions around the one-state solution. Welcome, Bashir. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Arlene. It's a great honor to be here. So let me tell you what I'm going to do with you in the coming 40, 50 minutes. I am going to, before I move into talking about the one state, which is a very vague term and a very vague title, I think we need seriously to unpack it. I want to set the context within which, the story or the necessity and the need of talking about one state emerged definitely in the last 20 years or so. And this is exactly what I'm going to spend in the first few minutes, where I will be making the claim that for us to understand the issue of the one-state discourse, we need to understand that there were enabling conditions, or there were developments and transformations that gave serious support and lended support to talking about the one-state. And these kind of changes or transformations all fit within what I call that we are in Israel-Palestine in the past few decades, definitely in the past 2 decades, more boldly than any time before, have been moving from an old paradigm to a new paradigm. And let me explain what does that mean, meaning like, concepts, terminologies, notions, vocabularies, definitions, and different types of engagements that have dominated the scene for the past few decades are increasingly losing some of their credibility, some of their explanatory power, and therefore this old paradigm, if you wish, or this old grammar, the way I call it, together with my friend Amos Goldberg from the Hebrew University, these jargon terminologies, concepts, notions, and definitions are losing some of their great credibility and possibility to capture, explain, and engage and analyze what has been going in Palestine, Israel for the past 2 decades or so. So the argument is that we are moving to a new grammar or a new paradigm that is under making. I'm not making the claim that this new grammar and paradigm is fully developed, but it is under making, ongoing, and the proofs that I want to name maybe 3-4 points that I want to indicate in these changes in order to set the scene for the rise of the one-state kind of discourse. And these changes definitely fit into this overarching claim that we are stepping now into a new paradigm that is undertaking and developing and ongoing and taking shape. And I want to name 3 or 4 depending on our time, and then move to the one state. And I think these are preliminary important points for us to understand where the context of the one state discourse is emerging and coming from. So let us take the first point that I want to indicate in order to prove that there is a new paradigm that is emerging, and this is the context within which we need to understand the one state discourse. The first point is basically the notion of partition is being basically reconsidered. For the overwhelming majority of the history of the Palestinian question, definitely since the 70s, meaning since the 1970s until today, largely the Palestinian question in the mainstream dominant approach was and has been actually articulated within the paradigm and the context of partition, meaning territorial partition. That is to suggest that according to the international community kind of agreement, or let us even say today even consensus almost, two-state solution is the way forward, and the two-state solution is premised on the idea of partitioning the land, which is traced back obviously to the partition plan and different types of engagement. But to cut a long story short, in this context, partition is not just a geographical plan. Partition is also an epistemological imagination, and it's a political and has a political implications. And therefore, for a very long time, any idea that, if you wish, went beyond or tried to challenge, interrogate, and question partition was looked at as if it is basically, irrelevant, not maybe utopian, escapist, radical, or whatsoever, whatever label you want to attach to these types of ideas. And now, in the past 2 decades, we are witnessing a very serious consideration of this whole partition, partition paradigm, whether territorial partition is the way forward. And the main contributor to challenging this kind of partition discourse and partition logic has been basically the Israeli colonial expansion. Probably you know and you are aware from previous classes, the numbers of settlers are increasing. The Israeli colonial greed is just, also is increasing. And as a consequence of that, there are people who are starting to cast very serious doubts to which extent territorial partition is reasonable and a feasible way of engaging with the question of Palestine, because basically the Israeli colonial settlements in the West Bank, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem have created irreversible kind of realities and intertwinement geographically and economically and environmentally and in different fashion, except that these kind of entanglement and intertwinement and interdependence is one of colonial nature, in which basically asymmetrical power relation dominates and control these types of engagements. So to cut a very long story short, of course, there is a very interesting history to trace back about this idea of partition and its genealogy as an imperial instrument in the service of imperial kind of plans, because Palestine was not the only territory post-Second World War that was basically partitioned. We have also, India and Cyprus, and the logic of partition has been out there engaged in a very interesting way. But without going too much into that history and contextualizing the genealogy of the development of the principle itself, which is an interesting, incredible point of reference and comparison could be very helpful. What is really important that this whole paradigm with which, the paradigm or the logic of partition, with which it comes also imagination, epistemology, what is permissible, what is imaginable, and what can be seen as legitimate and illegitimate in terms of engagement academically and politically, has been under very serious scrutiny, interrogation, and questioning, mainly because of the Israeli, colonial greed expansion, which is creating these irreversible facts on the grounds. Let alone, obviously, that there are many other considerations that needs to be traced back to the fact that actually under the rubric of Oslo, the conflict was designated as if it started in 1967, whereas actually the story goes to the Nakba and even before the Nakba. So this is the first point that I need to put forward that I think is incredibly important for you to understand in the context of the one-state discourse. The second point that I want to make that is intimately related to that is basically this whole discourse of peacemaking, economic development, and basically different types of economic growth and all of these terminologies also have been receiving very serious challenge in the past few years. Definitely after the Palestinian Authority embarked on this nation building and state building discourse, which was probably at some point a Palestinian national interest endorsed by the majority of the Palestinians, definitely at least in the West Bank and Gaza, where the hope was that within the parameters of Oslo, although Oslo never really spoke about a Palestinian state as to be the end, the end destination of the negotiations, but Palestinians within their own, mainstream political discourse, so is their leadership, were believing that actually the end point of this whole discourse is two states, and then international aid and different types of interventions, whether by the UN, World Bank, IMF, and different engagements with Palestine. Palestine being one of the biggest recipients of Palestinians being one of the biggest recipients of international aid. I mean, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, embarked on this project of nation building and state building. This project in the past 2 to 3 decades has been running into very serious trouble, because this discourse of state building falls in the old paradigm, and the old paradigm was hoping and articulated within the logic of the two-state solution and partition. And I want here to name a few risks that are involved in this peacemaking and economic development. I don't have much time. I recently gave a very extensive talk in Amman that was entirely devoted to these types of discourses of peacemaking, humanitarian aid, and basically the economic development and economic growth. But the brief of it, the danger of these types of discourses, with all the differences that might come in nuances and the analytical distinctions that is very useful between them, the trouble with these, or the risks that are involved in this, is that this peacemaking discourse depicts the story as if we are talking about two equal parties and symmetrical types of engagement. For instance, governments, maybe including the Brazilian government at some point, was saying, "Oh, we call upon both parties to express restraint," and all of that stuff. So these kind of both parties type of logic, basically drawing symmetry between the colonized and the colonizer, between the oppressed, who is the Palestinians, and the oppressor, who are the Israelis, and the state of Israel and its own different arms, is actually coming to be very deceiving, misleading, and very problematic. And therefore, more and more people have becoming much more vocal about actually that the reality on the ground since the beginning of Oslo, and surely in the last few years, is that the Israeli occupation went into being further enriched and further sophisticated, and actually structurally almost irreversible in terms of its control, the different details of the Palestinian lives, which includes basically controlling everything, including the sea, the air, the territory, the borders, and all of that stuff. So this kind of symmetry and equalizing between two striking asymmetrical and equal parties, incredibly, misleading, and Israelis have been insisting on this peace process precisely for this reason, meaning that they want that kind of concealed, hidden kind of, asymmetry of power to be kind of concealed, covered, and then this type of equality and parity come to the scene when basically the Israelis really control almost everything in terms of the lives of the Palestinians. And while at some point this discourse of state building was incredibly useful and important for the Palestinians within the parameters and the logic that the Palestinian state could have emerged, or the end destination of the negotiations would be a Palestinian state on the border of 1967, it turned out that the Palestinians are being asked to be in a perpetual, kind of endless project of nation, state building. The Palestinians have received certificate of excellence from the IMF, World Bank, and UN, and different other host of international organizations that prove that the Palestinians have become way much more ready than even neighboring countries with their institutions to become state, and the state is not there. And therefore, more and more, kind of doubts have emerged around the discourse of state building. And the last one, more and more also doubts have emerged around the discourse of development, because the Palestinians supposedly were being, receiving international aid in order to develop, where actually the Palestinian economy, under the rubric of Oslo for the past 30 years, has become way much more intertwined, and the Palestinians have become much more of a client entity in the service of the Israeli larger economy, which is much more powerful, and et cetera, et cetera. And largely, the actually investments in the Palestinian economy and society has been basically not according to the priorities of what the Palestinians see as incredible priorities, but according to the donors and the dictations that come with that, including basically not empowering the Palestinians, but largely making the Palestinians more dependent on Israel and international aid, and therefore basically weakening the Palestinians rather than strengthening the Palestinians. So to sum up this point, these types of discourses have become much more, have become much more under scrutiny, and more people have become way much more critical about this. And in order to shift away from this old paradigm and dominant paradigm of peacemaking, state building, and development and economic peace, with all the risks that come with them, more and more expert scholars, and surely Palestinians for a very long time, have been saying that basically the context within which we operate is one of settler colonialism and apartheid. And the advantages of invoking settler colonialism and apartheid are immense, definitely at the level of diagnosing. And that is basically the minute you engage in the question of settler colonialism as the structure that inform the realities and the dynamics on the ground in Palestine, then you are clearly putting the asymmetry of power at the very core of your attention and analysis. And therefore, the issue of, deceiving the deceiving construction of having two equal party gets from the very beginning under the rubric of settler colonialism disturbed and questioned, because we are already speaking about a colonial reality in which we clearly suggest that we have an oppressed and an oppressed, and colonized and a colonizer, and therefore, more and more people have become much more aware than any time before that actually we are at a clear reality of distorted power relation that needs to be brought into attention rather than the deceiving discourse of peace. And we need to, clearly indicate that Israel is the prime generator of these miseries, oppressions, colonization, at the expense of the Palestinians, who have become way much more oppressed than any time before in the past few decades. And obviously, apartheid is another category, which is basically a much more legal category, where the reality is that Israel is expanding. Israel is promoting this colonial greed and expansions in the heart of the West Bank, and rendering realities also irreversible in the aggressive, vulgar colonization in East Jerusalem. All of that actually casts doubt and invites for the category of Jewish supremacy and racial segregation, which apartheid captures. And therefore, more and more people have become much more interested in these conversations. And obviously, the recent publications of documents such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Israeli human rights organizations such as Beit Salim and Yesh Din. But earlier, the Palestinian Al-Haq and many other organizations have been saying this already for decades, that Israel is creeping into an apartheid form of regime that is promoting segregation based on racial lines and demarcations under the pretext of security. And therefore, the reality is that between the river and the sea, or at least in the West Bank and Gaza, according to some, is one of Jewish supremacy that is there, meaning that the whole entire structure is geared in order to service, to provide services and privileges to the Israeli settlers at the expense of the Palestinian Arabs, and the Palestinian Arab receive the basically peanuts and the remnants of structures of services and resources and access to different forms of resources, including basic rights of movement and freedom of that type of engagement. So to sum up this point, there is a very clear context now where more and more scholars, experts, luckily recently even diplomats and politicians have started saying, and now this is not like a view of radical marginal group, but also mainstream progressive human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights have started saying, well, we need to start calling the reality and to start calling these dynamics in a much more bolder way than that concealed, distorted peacemaking discourse and development and state building. The reality now is one of a new reality, which requires new terminologies, which requires new definitions and vocabularies for us to capture what's there. And therefore, people come up with these issues of settler colonialism and apartheid as basically tools and analytical frames through which we can better understand what is happening. And the advantage of using these alternative discourses, meaning apartheid and settler colonialism, is that among many other things that they bring to the equation, they bring this issue of asymmetry of power, and bring this issue of the colonial nature of the engagement in the West Bank and Gaza, at least, And some go as far as to suggest that this goes and applies to the whole entire territory between the river and the sea. This brings a much more, if you wish, between quote unquote, much more refreshing perspective, meaning that it gives us at least much more critical tools to understand and name things the way they are and start engaging with them with responsibility rather than escape them under the rubric and under the language of development and peacemaking. So the last point that I want to make it before I move to unpack some of the things concerning the one state is that another shift that is being indicated is basically this shift. The third point that I want to mention is this shift basically from statehood to rights. So there are more and more people who have been suggesting that, if the Israelis are not keen to accept one of the most generous, if not the most generous, offer that a colonized nation in modern times has offered to its colonizers, and that is giving up 20, 70, 80% of their land. That is the state of Israel in the so-called Israel proper within the boundaries of 1948, where the green line, which separates between the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and the rest of Israel, is respected and looked at as a line of demarcations for political boundaries. If Israel is not keen to accept that, meaning that the Palestinians are willing to give up 70, 80% of their land, that is what Israel came to be established in 1948 in the Nakba, and the Palestinians are asking only for 22%, which is basically the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. And what Israel is doing is actually trying all it can to basically kill this possibility, mostly through an aggressive Israeli Jewish colonial expansion and settlements, where Israel is creating a reality of Pantostan and a Swiss cheese reality of channel, disintegrated and segregated Palestinian kind of enclaves and islands that are being disrupted by the Israeli colonial infrastructures and settlements and bypass roads and fences and segregation wall and different types of technologies of surveillance and control, then more and more people have said, well, the Palestinians in their national movement shifted to accept a state or partition in the mid-70s, without going too much into the history of Palestinian nationalism. But at least the Palestinian national movement start hinting in a very bold way already around the mid-70s, late 70s, that they are willing to accept the international, supposedly mainstream international view, and that is to accept the two-state solution, where the Palestinians will largely accept a state on the boundaries of on the boundaries of 1967, which is basically only 22% of historic Palestine. But the reality of today, meaning in 2023, is that Israel is entirely not keen to give the Palestinians this issue of the two-state solution on the lines of 1967. But Israel actually is doing all it can in order to render that almost impossible and not feasible through expansions of settlements, creating facts on the ground and different technologies of control and oppression. And therefore, more and more people have come to argue that if that is the case, then the Palestinians will start shifting to suggest that their struggle need to be understood how it should be understood from day one. And that is that this Palestinian struggle is about emancipation and liberation, self-determination and return. And these are all rights. And therefore, people have said, we need to be extremely vigilant and very careful not to create this issue of state as to be a holy cow or a holy aim. This is just an instrumental vehicle of an apparatus within which the Palestinians realize rights. And if this state is going to be a liability on the Palestinians, and it's going to be just a lip service that the different politicians in the world pay, definitely the Europeans and the US, with their dishonesty and their double standards and their hypocrisy, saying that they are supporting this idea while they are actually barely doing anything of meaning and value to exert pressure on Israel to come to terms with these issues. Then more and more people are suggesting that the Palestinian cause should shift now, or the Palestinian struggle should be articulated more in the concepts of rights. And more importantly, among these rights is basically the issue of the rights, the issues of the rights of basically liberation, self-determination, and return as a collective, and then host of all other rights that are granted to individuals. And therefore, the implications of that is that more and more people start saying that basically the whole entire territory between the river and the sea, meaning between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, the whole entire what we call mandate Palestine, is one political unit of analysis, which includes the whole entire Palestinian people, including the Palestinians in Israel. And therefore, what we need to engage with is engage in a struggle where we decolonize and dismantle the Israeli privileges and the Israeli colonial structure in favor of an inclusive, egalitarian form of politics that can take the title of the one state. And on the way, people really invoke different types of claims in order to demonstrate that Israel entirely unkeen and definitely not sincere and not willing to move towards the two-state solution. Many things that I mentioned, such as the settlements, the realities Israel is creating in Jerusalem, but also basically the basic law that Israel legislated in relation to its own definition, which basically Israel, what we call the nation state law, which basically Israel claims that the only group that is entitled for self-determination is basically the Israeli Jews, and in that sense, the Palestinians are in a very, are not entitled for any form of, kind of having their own state in their homeland. So there are many things that I can label more and more, but I think I'm setting the context reasonably, at least in a way to suggest that for us to understand the rise of this one-state discourse, we need to take, among many other considerations, these types of developments and shifts, because the one-state discourse would have not emerged with the way it has become relevant, at least for academic and political conversations, if we would have not understood these dynamics and changes and many other dynamic and changes related mostly to the Israeli society, its own internal structures, and the way the Israeli Jewish society has transformed in terms of its makeup, the ideology, and the type of ultra-nationalist and sometimes even fascist Israeli Zionist supremacist politicians such as Ben Gvir and Smotrich, which I don't have time to speak about all of that, but at least these developments also lend very serious support to those who are wanting to entertain alternatives to this. So let me just summarize what I have been doing thus far for those who probably felt that I have been a little bit too quick, too speedy, and talking very quickly. So thus far, I wanted really to set the context and indicate some very important shifts that are moving from an old grammar that dictates the imagination, the terminologies, and the concepts that we think about Israel-Palestine. This old paradigm is collapsing. These terms are losing their credibility to explain. And we are shifting into a new paradigm, into a new territory, into a new grammar, which requires a new terminologies, vocabularies, concepts, and definitions for us to make understanding of what is happening. It is in this context that the one-state discourse makes sense. And I named three major shifts in order to demonstrate this move from the old paradigm to the new paradigm. The first shift that I spoke is about moving from partition to alternatives to partition. Partition falls in the old paradigm, in the old grammar, and alternatives to partition falls into the new paradigm, the new grammar. The second one that I did was to suggest that actually the old paradigm is populated by different types of languages and discourses. Most importantly, among these languages and discourses is the language basically of peacemaking, state building, and economic development, and different types of host of related matters. This is an old discourse within the old grammar. We are moving and shifting to a new terminology, much more critical one of settler colonialism and one of apartheid, under which there are calls to decolonize. This is the new paradigm in this shift, the new grammar. The last point that I wanted to say as a shift was this shift from statehood discourse into rights, suggesting that in the old paradigm, the Palestinian struggle was articulated around the issue of having two states, where the Palestinians believe that they are compromising in a very generous way due to international pressure, among many other things, and their own, and their own capabilities and power relation that was at their disposal, accepting the international pressure and coming to terms with what they can do, and that is accepting 22% of historic Palestine and giving Israel 78%. Israel made sure that that is, with the time, almost impossible. And we are running very close to the point where this is going to be very, almost, if not already, impossible to have this two-state and around at least this logic. And now, more and more people are saying that we need to articulate the Palestinian question much more in the language of rights. And this whole question of Palestine was any way to start with about rights rather than about state. State is just a vehicle and an instrument in the service of realizing rights. And the very basic important thing about Palestinian struggle is about rights, and more chiefly among these rights is emancipation, self-determination, and the Palestinian right of refugees to return. This is what I have done thus far. So now let me just move into concretely speak that in the new grammar, in the new paradigm, obviously most of the conversation revolves around basically the one state, or let us call it alternatives to partition. And I want to distinguish in this rubric of one state about some analytical differentiations that we need to label under the rubric this of one state, because I think this one state label is a little bit misleading. What is definitely true about those who invoke the one state is that they want to treat the whole entire territory between the river and the sea as one, meaning that the whole entire land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, historic Palestine, some go in the Israeli side and call it Eretz Israel, quote unquote, should be the territory within which a new political reality should emerge, a new political structure should emerge, and this new political structure should emerge where it dismantles and basically dismantles the existing structure of Jewish supremacy and domination in favor of something much more inclusive. Okay, but I think it's really valuable to distinguish between three strands in order to navigate our way analytically in the landscape that is called one state. Because I think sometimes people use this label without really doing any serious analytical work in order to distinguish between an incredibly important differences with different understandings or approaches to the one state. Because it's one thing to say that you are in favor of one state. It's totally another thing to start saying which one state that you are in favor of. Even if you want to move from one of Jewish supremacy and Jewish colonial, Jewish Israeli, not Jewish, Jewish Israeli, colonial supremacy and control, then the question becomes is what is the type of state that you want to move towards? And here I want to distinguish between three variants of one state that I think incredibly important to distinguish, which are actually useful for us, or actually to make it easier for me, because I don't know to which extent those who are attending this class have background in political theory and political science. So let me make it even simpler and saying that I want to actually, in a non-reductionist, non-exhaustive way, distinguish between two hosts or two kind of clusters of potential one state, and then in these clusters there are also some nuances, variations here and there. I will send Arlene an article that I published a few years ago, which does better work than I will be presenting here, and will be a little bit more exhaustive than I am presenting here, and she can share it with you. But for the purpose of saving time and for the purpose of elaborating here, I think it's incredibly important to distinguish between what I call a liberal approach to the one state and a binational approach to the one state. And I think these are incredibly important distinctions to draw. And what I want to spend for the rest of the 20 minutes or 15 minutes that are that are available for me is to distinguish and define a little bit and unpack what I mean by a liberal approach to the one state and what I mean by a binational approach to one state. And these are two analytical, normative, if you wish, framings that, of course, there are other ways of looking at this and additional more complications that I'm presenting, but I'm just, for the purpose of clarity and analytical ease, I'm just sticking only to these. So the liberal approach to the one state, and I insist that the liberal is different from the binational, okay? The liberal approach to the one state, I would argue, is actually the one that dominates the scene of those who argue and call and advocate for one state. They might not call themselves liberals. Some might, but others might not. But what is really interesting about it is that these people usually call for what is often, what is often invoked as one person, one vote. And here there is a very serious inspiration from the South African case. And this is really an interesting and fascinating, because basically the one person, one vote mantra is an incredibly liberal, at least in some way, it's an incredibly liberal enterprise. And here it is liberal precisely because it focuses on individuals and their rights. It doesn't focus on collectives, and definitely not on national groups, but it focuses on individuals and their rights. And the understanding that you want to engage here in a way where you look at the people that populate the land between the river and the sea as equal citizens, or you want to aspire to move to a political reality of one state in which citizenship is the ultimate reference for definition, and citizenship that is defined not along vulgar ethno-national kind of attributes, but is defined along civic, inclusive, territorial understandings of belonging to political community, that is the demos, not the ethnos, then the understanding here is that we are talking actually about individuals who constitute this political community. And these individuals are entitled to rights. And these rights could go all the way from freedom of association, freedom of movement, equality, rule of law, constitutional structures that are there in order to create checks and balances, and many other host of institutions and norms that govern whatever political reality of individual citizens. Now, the interesting story in this concept is that actually those who want to advocate this one person, one vote, in a way, without really sometimes naming that, they are basically going to the direction of what we call post-national civic kind of identity, where basically the entry to these whole conversations are individuals and their rights, and therefore there is an imagination at some point that the political community that you want to create, the so-called we, or the people, or the nation, is made of individual citizens, and individual citizens that are, coming together, under the rubric of rule of law and different kind of elements of liberal liberties and liberal freedoms, and institutional design that corresponds to that. Now, and many obviously attach an attribute to this one person, one vote in incredibly emancipatory power and emancipatory potential, definitely to the Palestinians, that they will be emancipated from the Israeli control and occupation, and obviously dismantling the structure of Jewish Israeli hegemony and control. But also they attach to that some very serious emancipatory power to the Israeli Jews, who under this rubric will be actually leaving their Jewish national identity, or someone might be saying de-Zionize them or de-Israelize them, or whatever term that you want to use to capture the requirement of distancing them, the Israeli Jews, distancing the Israeli Jews from their national identity in favor of something that is overarching, which is basically individual liberties and rights under the rubric of, of one state of some sort. Now, obviously, this kind of I am being, reductionist, and I know there are different variations. There could be a multicultural one where groups can be recognized, but under the rubric of more kind of cultural, ethnic, religious diversity rather than national one. I don't want to come naive. I myself, my earlier work was devoted to multiculturalism, and I have done important work in that respect, also tying this to historical injustice together with the Canadian philosopher Will Kimlicka. So, but I'm not going into that. I just want you to get a taste that those who are asking for one state, the dominant strand of it is actually one person, one vote. And there are different actually manifestos out there. If you can Google them, you will find them advocating that type of trajectory. Now, the challenge with this, and I here want to name only one challenge because I don't have time, and that is basically that they seem to be believing that there could be a we that we can create that is called the nation or the people, and this we can meld different powerful structural differences, including identitarian kind of dimensions of identity, of nationalism that would collapse for the purpose of an inclusive civic territorial form of identity that will be structured around individual citizenship. And many, or not many, some scholars have basically say, okay, we can see how there is an incredible potential of liberation and emancipation, definitely when that is articulated within the rubric of diagnosing the reality of one of settler colonialism and wanting to move to one state of individuals, of one person, one vote. But then that doesn't really tell us much about how do we need to deal with Jewish Israeli national identity that emerged in the land, though it's colonial, but what do we do with it? And how it's going to be easy, convincing, and feasible, let alone what are the moral requirements that will be at the disposal of asking the Israeli Jews to move away from this national identity. And let alone some might go as far as to suggest that this is also problematic because you are asking the Palestinians to distance themselves from their national identity, because the Palestinians, not because they are romanticizing national identity or nationalism to start with, but any basic understanding of Palestinian nationalism cannot overlook the fact that that Palestinian identity in national terms is emancipatory, because Palestinians, since the First World War until today, have been facing in a consistent way, negation, denial, and misrecognition. This is exactly the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration doesn't recognize the Palestinian people. The Israeli politician and the state of Israel didn't recognize the Palestinian as a people until the 80s, and Smotrich and many others, even today, they don't believe that the Palestinians exist as a people. Therefore, attaching yourself to the national discourse might be not easy as the post-national civic one person, one vote liberal proposal seem to be doing. And therefore, some challenges are being labeled along these lines and many other lines. But this invites me to the second approach with which I want to finish, which basically precisely because of their critique of the centrality of nationalism. For the Palestinians for their own reasons, and for the Israeli Jews for different reasons. And I'm not equating, and I'm not saying these are equally valid, neither that I am attaching to them the same normative, ethical, moral weight. Of course, the Israelis are a colonial, the Israeli Jewish identity is a colonial, settler colonial one, which also draws an incredibly important asymmetry, and the Palestinians are the victims of Zionism. That's in order to insist on this issue of asymmetry, even if I'm taking nationalism seriously. Then this paves the way for the second type of approach, and that is basically binationalism. And here, the different strands states basically that the unit of analysis and the starting point of analysis is not one of individual rights and citizens, but rather of national groups, or to start with groups, but not all groups, but a very specific type of group, and that is basically nationalism. And here the argument is, sorry, 1 second. And here the argument is that actually the minute we enter into the conversation through the starting point of analysis of groups, not individual citizens, but groups of national groups, meaning two national groups. This is why we have the bi. The bi doesn't say we have multinational, we have binationals, meaning that there is a Palestinian Arab national identity, and there is an Israeli Jewish national identity, which is settler colonial in its dimensions. And if this is the entry to the equation, then actually some have argued and made the claim that actually binationalism that insists on national grouping is a much more promising identity, if not for any reason, at least for the reasons of feasibility and reasonableness of potential development along these lines of developing something political that might be acceptable. And therefore, they say, under the rubric of binationalism, the entry would be basically speaking about the fact that we have two national groups, although they are very different in nature and magnitude, and responsibility in relation to the existing rigid realities that are one of domination and oppression. But we need to take them seriously, and taking them seriously meaning that we are entering here with a different also different sets of rights, not individual rights, but actually besides or in addition to individual rights, we are entering here with basically collective national rights, most chiefly among rights of national groups, the most important and the most fundamental rights of national groups. What make a national group unique compared to many other groups is their right to national self-determination. And if that is if that is the entry, then some have said that we need to go to one state kind of engagement and constellations, where we need to start on this issue of having two national groups entitled to national self-determination, each one of them entitled to national self-determination, where they need to be governed by egalitarian form of engagement, where equality, reciprocity, parity, and mutual legitimacy needs to guide this process. Now, those who are advocating these types of thinking are not naive to suggest that there is an equality between Palestinian national movement and the Israeli Jewish identity that emerged in Palestine as a national movement, in addition to being a settler colonial movement. They clearly say that there has to be a very powerful decolonizing power here, where the structure of Jewish supremacy and hegemony will have to be deconstructed. But you would agree with me that here, the minute you start saying that your starting point of analysis, with all the complications and nuances that you bring into it, if your starting point of analysis is one of national groups, then you are already engaging with a different types of reality, with a different types of sets of rights. And here, people have made the claim that actually, or scholars have made the claim that engaging in the conversation on the premise of national rights brings different nuances and different sensitivities. For the Palestinians, I have said they have been denied in a consistent fashion against colonial and imperial powers their national identity as an indigenous people of the land that have been all the time stripped. And it's actually the most important Palestinian achievement since the Nakba until today, that the Palestinians managed to rewrite themselves back into history as a national group. And therefore, people talk to them, and probably you are making this actually course to start with, because the Palestinians constitute a people that have a revolutionary movement historically that is attempting to achieve emancipation and their rights. Because I'm not entirely sure if the Palestinians would have been sporadic individuals struggling for their rights. I'm not entirely sure if they are not galvanizing and organizing and assembling themselves around a national identity. I'm not entirely sure to which extent their political power might be effective. For the Israeli Jews, obviously, for a host of many other reasons, including obviously, Jewish, including European Christian anti-Semitism, specificities of Jewish history that relates to persecution, Holocaust, and many other host of considerations, it's very hard to expect from the Israeli Jews to get into the conversation of a political settlements, even one that is interested in decolonizing and giving up Jewish supremacy and privileges. It's hard to imagine that many Israelis would be willing to come into this conversation and under the rubric of individual citizens. They would probably most likely, due to their own kind of sensitivities and the specificities, come into these conversations as actually Jewish national Israeli group. And under no circumstances here I am suggesting that Zionism, or for that sake, the Israeli Jewish national identity that Zionism managed to create in Israel, is equal to the Jewish people. Jewish people is a different thing than Israeli Jewish identity. So if you go along these lines of, if you wish, getting into the political conversation, starting with national groups, two separate national groups, the Palestinians and the Israelis, with host of normative considerations attached to that, that is reciprocity, parity, mutual legitimacy, and obviously the need to decolonize and have a historical reconciliatory process, which will dismantle Jewish Israeli Zionist privileges and supremacy, and will have to come to terms with the right of Palestinian refugees and the ongoing consequences of the Nakba, because the Nakba, as probably you have heard from Ilyas and many other scholars that taught you in this course, is not a past but ongoing reality that every single Palestinian everywhere in the world feels it with different variation, varied degrees. So if that is something sensible, meaning that the national interest is a potential possible way of entering into the conversation, then the way we articulate and the way we cash out this kind of binational entry might take a host of various institutional and constitutional designs. And this can go all the way from one state in the form of having two national groups coming into the parliament with equal powers and equal representation, irrespective of numbers, but having basically a form of one kind of state that might be a federation or takes different types of modalities and forms. Or it can go all the way to be actually a confederation. And I suspect that you should be aware about the serious differences between a federation and confederation. Basically, confederation is usually a different creature, which is basically, in simplistic way, it is two almost sovereign bodies come together, giving up some of their authorities for the service, for the purpose of joining on an overarching structure that serves certain issues, interests, and agreements of different types of magnitude. So what I'm trying to say that actually binationalism can be cashed out and translated in multiple modalities and various forms. I don't know to which extent you are aware. For instance, there is this initiative called one land, or a homeland, two states, which falls under this rubric. There are there are much more detailed confederation kind of proposals, and there are other ideas that take nationalism seriously but don't collapse into confederation or a strong form of federative politics. There are many issues and many kind of modalities and articulations that might really populate this scene. So I think with these, bearing this in mind, what I want to say, and by this I finish, is that I think the one state is just a term or a slogan or a title or a rubric that is being often used, but we need to be incredibly careful to understand that it's not. It's easy to say that you want a one state. I think it's incredibly important to understand that one state can mean many things. And even if you are committed to an emancipatory, decolonizing, egalitarian form of politics in this one state, this can take different shapes, different forms, which will matter for people. And the assessment of the strength of them needs to be attached to scholars, politicians, and activists who are involved in the field. The binational miniature has the risks of, scholars have identified one or two risks among many other risks that I want to mention. One is that it reproduces nationalism, which is the source to start of the problem. So basically, having nationalism within even egalitarian or within the frame of binationalism is still working with nationalism, which is exclusionary, runs risks of balkanization, etc., etc. I think there is an answer to that, because you can also be committed to a thinner form of nationalism. But nevertheless, this is a very powerful argument. Another very serious issue here, which is an incredibly sensitive issue for Palestinians, and that is basically binationalism already involves some form of tacit or explicit recognition of a Jewish Israeli national identity, which is an incredibly costly to the Palestinians, because in a way, this also recognizes some form of legitimacy of Jewish-Israeli existence, which by implications might call for very serious revisions of certain parameters or fundamentals of Palestinian national mainstream Orthodox understanding and narrative. But again, I think these are incredibly powerful critiques. I don't have time to elaborate or try to potentially provide ways of engaging with these types of critiques. But I think the thing that I want to say is that these normative principles, whether the liberal one or the binational one, these are normative analytical parameters. I think they can be cashed out in host of institutions and constitutions that might come to answer these types of principles. So I stop here, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Rashid. This has been very, very informative. I think that whoever noted down has been able to organize very well the idea around this whole debate following your exposition. And I'd like then to start with the questions that we're beginning to receive. The first one here from Rafael. Do you think that by not backtracking on its Zionist desires, the state of Israel may be, in a way, achieving its purposes with the emergence of these new terminologies? In particular, about the shift.
I am not hearing you well. Could you please speak slowly and from the very beginning? Yes, sorry about that.
So I'm going to read the question that was sent, by Rafael. Do you think that by not backtracking on its Zionist desires, the state of Israel may be, in a way, achieving its purposes with the emergence of these new terminologies? In particular, about the shift between ideals of a Palestinian nation state versus the emergence of demands for Palestinian rights. So I guess his question is, if you think that this new terminology regarding Palestinian rights may be...
I think I understood the question, but I hope I understood the question. But I think Rafael's question invites for something very serious that I think we need to pay attention to. It's incredibly interesting and important to say that Palestinians deserve right, and then they can organize and reshape their politics around rights. But I think it might be, I would go as far as to say that it might be suicidal for the Palestinians to step too much into the liberal territory at a premature early stage of engagement. And why I am saying that? And I think in that sense, sorry, what did you say, Arlene? You are muted, Arlene.
I'm sorry, Bashir. You said suicidal. You think it might be suicidal, right?
Yes, okay. to the Palestinians. Meaning that it's incredibly dangerous. I mean, it might be suicidal to say rights if these rights are understood largely under the rubric of liberal kind of things. Because, one of the things that you need to bear in mind that in international scene and international language, unfortunately, despite this whole apparatus that speaks about human rights, which is incredibly important, but we need also to be extremely critical and not romanticize this discourse of human rights, and not to, overlook the hypocrisy, the dishonesty, the politics of deceit, and the power relation, and the imperial types of engagement that are engaged with that. One of the things that the Palestinians are achieving, incredible achievements, despite the fact that Israel has become way much more aggressive than any time before in its history vis-a-vis the Palestinians, despite the fact that the Palestinians are at a miserable conditions of dishonesty, disarray, issues of lack of legitimacy of the existing Palestinian leadership, discrepancy between the Palestinian leadership and the populace and the public opinion, many issues that can be characterized to Palestinian nation. But there is one thing that I think that Palestinians can say with confidence, and that is that their national identity is very powerful. And Israel is aggressively trying to disfragment them, and this is exactly the issue of likely define and rule, meaning not only divide and rule, define, divide, and rule. Israel defines the Palestinians in Israel as Arab Israelis, East Jerusalemites, the Gazans, the West Bankers, and different types of categories. So that's an incredibly powerful fragmentation. But however, largely, the Palestinians are relevant for international scene and international politics historically and presently. Historically, for the decolonization movements. I mean, I don't need to talk to you about this. The global South is incredibly important for this. And the global South is emerging now with global Palestine for its significance for different sets of engagements. But self-determination was the most structuring, definitive, constitutive element of this kind of historical period. So I think Rafael, if I understood his question is right, is definitely true. And it might be actually to the benefit of Israel if the Palestinians were to give up incredible amount of achievements that they achieved under the rubric and the title of nationhood. And this is why, as much as I have sympathy to the shift to rights, I think this shift to rights needs to be incredibly done with care, with ease, and definitely without abandoning the national entry. The Palestinians constitute a nation. Nations are entitled to much more higher, demanding, normatively higher and demanding rights than other groups. The most important normative demanding ethical rights that national groups are entitled to and other groups are not entitled to is national self-determination. The Palestinians are incredibly important that they stick to the language of national self-determination. And in that sense, I don't mind if the Palestinians continue to stick to the strategy of nationhood and statehood, not because I have the illusion that the statehood is going to achieve the state is going to be achieved very soon. It's just that I think the Palestinians can accumulate more rights and more relevance for the international scene as a national group. And this is why it's incredibly important that the Palestinians move very swiftly to unify and reform their national institutions in a way where these national institutions are not becoming liability on the Palestinians, but become a source of empowerment, as the PLO was in the late 60s and early 70s and all the way until the 80s.
Thank you. Right. The second question that has come, Bashir, is how can we think of a real alternative to the modern national state model based on these new paradigms, new grammars, beyond the liberal national? So how can we think of a real alternative to the modern national state based on the new grammar and beyond the liberal model?
I like this question. So, I mean, you are. I mean, one thing, you know, we seem to be sometimes scholars operating within the hegemony and the tyranny of national methodologism. Basically, nationalism actually is an incredibly modern phenomenon. Actually, the overwhelming majority of the world states, the overwhelming majority of the states in the world, they are as old as 20 to 100, 120 years. The overwhelming, more than 99% of them. If you take the exception of France and Britain, and to a lesser extent the United States, with a few other exceptions here and there, the overwhelming majority of states, you know, they are anywhere between 20 and even less, such as Sudan, South and North Sudan, and take it to all the way to Germany, that was unified only in the late 80s, early 90s, all the way to Italy, that stretches all the way, probably it was an Independence Day a few days ago, or very soon coming, I think, basically 100-something years, okay? So nationalism is a new phenomena. The imperial order used to be the structuring order of global politics for centuries or for hundreds of years, at least. Nationalism emerged powerfully after the second and surely after the first and surely after the Second World War. And this is why many of these countries, including India, they are a result of the Second World War, the way we know their boundaries now. So to come and believe and suggest that nationalism is with us for eternity is nonsensical. Even if you go to the primordial approach of understanding nationalism, not the constructionist one, still, even in your primordial understanding, nationalism, in my point of view, is a modern phenomena par excellence, even if it relies on religion and ethnicities of different tribal kind of nature. Having said that, as critical as one can be about nationalism, and there are incredible reasons to be critical about nationalism, because in the overwhelming majority of the cases, nationalism is exclusionary. Nationalism is actually very vulgar in many understanding, and in some cases, it's very genocidal too. We know that. But to come and label nationalism as one phenomena is actually a little bit problematic, because I think there is a difference between vulgar ethno-nationalism that articulates itself in chauvinism and fascism and Nazism, and between forms of nationalism that are different than that. I don't want to say, different. I'm not romanticizing French republicanism for that. Okay, I think there are a lot of critique that we can label against these kind of republican, supposedly territorial civic forms of nationalism, because they were involved in a very imperial nature of engagements, and their records when it comes to human rights and their engagement in the colonies is definitely not something that they should be proud of, even if they sometimes try to conceal it and try to kind of take it away from being considered heavily. Having said that, I don't think that the Palestinians do have at their disposal a way much more relevant terminology, politically and legally, that is going to enable them to continue and carry on with their struggle. Palestinians might, with this settler colonial discourse, invoke into the equation indigeneity and indigenous rights, but the Palestinians should not follow into the risk of talking about indigeneity and indigenous rights, because that is usually understood with the rubric of international politics and sometimes even in international law, in a way, as sometimes of disappearing communities and tiny insignificant numbers. Palestinians are not tiny insignificant numbers. They are tiny insignificant numbers. It depends to what, but they are definitely constitute half of the population between the river and the sea. That is not insignificant. The Palestinians in the homeland between the river and the sea constitute 50 to 51% soon. So the Palestinians are soon to be the majority in the land, if nothing changed demographically or Israel doesn't embark on any displacing or ethnic cleansing form of policies. So I understand the risks that come with nationalism, but I also understand the opportunities that come with nationalism. The question that should be posed to the Palestinians, and by this I finish because I want to allow more questions, is that actually the history of Palestinian nationalism is really fascinating. Until the 70s, until the mid-70s, Palestinian nationalism was largely territorial and inclusive. It wasn't heavily ethnicized. This is why there was a space for the Jew in Palestinian nationalism. The Jew could have been a Palestinian under that rubric, and actually there were Jews who joined the Palestinian PLO. It's not secret that actually Fatah did have members who were Jews, identified as Jews. The interesting story that with Palestinian nationalism adopting partition in the mid-70s, and much more boldly after the first Intifada, and surely with Oslo, paradoxically, Palestinian nationalism became a little bit much more ethnicized and paradoxically closer to the form of Zionism than. I'm not saying that Palestinian nationalism is like Zionism under no circumstances. I was just saying that Palestinian nationalism have become much more Arabized, ethnicized, in the way that Palestinian nationalism in post-Nakba time, and maybe before the Nakba, but surely post-Nakba time, around the 60s, was very much informed and heavily, borrowed the language of Marxism, Maoism, Leninism, socialism, without romanticizing these legacies. I'm not saying that I am romanticizing these legacies. I'm just saying that in that sense, Palestinian nationalism was defined not necessarily heavily and exclusively around ethnic lines. But I understand the risks that come with that. I don't think it's wise that the Palestinians abandon their position of national meaning precisely when the Palestinians have been subject to denial and negation for most of their modern history precisely on this issue, that they are not a nation. The evangelicals probably also the Zionist evangelicals in the world, including in Brazil, which is incredibly alarming, might view the Palestinians as just aliens in the service of God plans for the service of Jews, where the Palestinians, again, are stripped from being indigenous local people who have identity. So, as much as I have a critique that can be labeled reasonably in relation to Zionism, in relation to nationalism, I think nationalism as an entry should not be romanticized in Palestinian nationalism, but continues and possibly capable of being emancipatory and with an incredible important potential. And this is why Zionism, for most of its history and later on the State of Israel and some of its politicians now continue to say that Palestinians are not a nation. Because if they are a nation, then they are entitled to the basic rights that nations are entitled. Most chiefly among these rights is self-determination. Where do nations self-determine themselves? In their homeland. Where is the Palestinian homeland? In Israel, their homeland. This is why Israelis don't want, and they want to deny that rights of the Palestinians. And this is why some European powers were dishonestly and engaging with that nonsensical conversation for a while. Now, obviously, most of Europe is in a different place, but the dishonesty of Europe now and the hypocrisy of the US and the dishonesty of US is that they now pay lip service to that question of Palestinian self-determination. Before that, they didn't recognize. Now that they recognize that, and now they don't want to act actively to translate that self-determination into a viable Palestinian statehood that might answer the minimal aspirations of the Palestinians.
There, activated. Well, thank you. Bashir, there's a question here. Is this idea of the one state, binational state, how does it relate to Martin Buber's ideas pre-1948?
This is another excellent question. It does relate. I mean, it depends where you go to trace the roots of this kind of ideas. These ideas are largely being used by scholars more than politicians, because, as I said earlier, most of those who advocate the one state solution, they seem to endorse the one person, one vote type of thing, taking South Africa as an example of an inspiration for that. And South Africa is a rainbow nation of liberal kind of individual. For the binational, the binationalism is definitely has a very interesting Jewish roots in some sort. Not only Martin Buber, Magnus flirted with this idea as well. Hannah Arendt flirted with this idea as well. So there were people in the Israeli, on the Jewish Zionist side of the story, that were actually marginal. So there is some very interesting overlap with that tradition. Now I just realized that I should move the screen so I can see that. Sorry about that. But so there are interesting sources that you can draw on and engage with, which are incredibly important and interesting, including Buber, but not only Buber, Magnus, and many others, and Hannah Arendt herself. It's just that I think the context of the reality of the specificities of Israel-Palestine today is one of different magnitude. And the Israelis and the Palestinians are equal in terms of number. Israel's colonial Zionist enterprise have become way much more lethal than any time before. And I think the minute you start engaging with the egalitarian logic of binationalism in modern contemporary reality, that has the way, at least I do that in my work separately and in my joint work with my friend and colleague Amos Goldberg from the Hebrew University in that book on the Holocaust and the Nakba and many other host of articles that we published together in the Journal of Genocide Research earlier and other pieces that we put together. is that actually it has a very serious interrogative potential to Jewish account, to Jewish Israeli hegemony and control and all of that stuff. There is a very specific history where these types of ideas back in the time in the 30s and the 40s emerged among these circles, with Brit Shalom, Ihud, and all of these kind of Jewish groups that emerged that were heavily informed by basically Bohemia, and were now Czechia and Slovakia and Germany, that were multinational groups anyway, and the Austro-Hungarian remnants of that types of conversation. So it's not surprised that these people were actually drawing from that kind of context. So Zionism, in its vulgar mainstream way, whether in its political or socialist articulation or labor articulation, was very much a form of ethno-nationalism, basically very much drawing on resources that were at their disposal as Eastern and Central European forms of nationalism that heavily informed. So there are impacts, there are traces to be traced to this idea of binationalism, but I would caution against believing that the way at least I and Amos articulate egalitarian binationalism departs from the way, in significant way at least, in certain respects, than this older notions of binationalism, though there is clearly some form of overlap of some sort, of course. But, during that time also the Holocaust, neither the Holocaust nor the Nakba was there still, the way we actually articulate. By the way, the book came out in Japanese, and the book is coming out in September in Italian. And I know that Amos is speaking in Germany next week about the book. So it's incredible the interest of people in these ideas of how you go deep into these binational ideas through. Now, I don't want to come across now as if I'm marketing only my ideas. This is why I was very careful not to name myself and to name my scholarship in that. And I was careful, per your request, Arlene, back in the time, to map out much more wider spectrum of ideas that are helpful for the disposal of the listeners and the students, for them to navigate their way in much more meaningful way in the landscape that is way much more complicated and multi-layered and diverse than the specific views that I hold myself scholarly and personally in relation to that. So yes, there are overlaps with the idea of historic binationalism, but there are very significant departures from that idea, which make the idea, the way we speak about it in the very specific context of today's politics, informed by the history of what has happened and marched in Israel, Palestine, has an incredibly very powerful potential of interrogating Jewish Israeli nationalism, Zionism, with very powerful transformative potential that eliminates any form of Jewish privilege, any form of Jewish Israeli sovereignty that is exclusive. And I think that is incredibly transformative and challenging compared to an earlier articulations of binationalism, at least as far as I recall them. You are muted, Arlene. I didn't hear anything.
Bashir, here there's a question. Right. Okay. I understood how the binational idea leaves the space for the potentialities of nationalism, but would it also open the door to the dangers of secularism?
Oh wow, you guys are posing very tough questions all the time. Not even a single question that I like that. That's very good. It's a pity I'm not in Sao Paulo. That's
sorry, I have to mute myself because there's noise here.
Sorry?
I said, sorry, there's some noise here, so I mute myself.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So I think this is probably an incredibly challenging question, and I'm not entirely sure I have a exhaustive full answer to it. So yes, I do think, and I do see that there's risks that are involved. I myself, actually, at the very end of my talk, I myself raised this critique, if you remember, by saying those who argue against this kind of thing say that basically insisting on the national entry is basically, reproducing nationalism. So you are not, and nationalism was the source, or is the source of controversy about this stuff. But here I want to invoke one point, 2 points. One point that I think seems powerful as an argument, and the other one I want to concede and acknowledge a weakness of some sort. Okay. So the more powerful point that I want to put forward, that I think is incredibly important, is that actually what makes nationalism in this context, under the rubric of the egalitarian binationalism we advocate, at least the way I understood it and the way understands it and the way I want to promote it, because I also should be writing a book that is called egalitarian binationalism. I actually have a contract now already. But now I am doing these talks, which takes me away, from, I'm just thinking. So coming back to the point is that if you take nationalism seriously, the way we articulated under the rubric of egalitarian binationalism, it's true that the entry is national self-determination, but notice that the entry to national self-determination here, under no circumstances, in the specificities and the particularities of Israel-Palestine, it means an exclusive nation state. There is no space for a Jewish state here. There is no way. I mean, there is no Jewish majority that is located in one clean, continuous territory. The Arabs and the Jews are way much more intertwined and reside in top and inside each other. And they reside and live on top of each other under the language of domination, control, and hegemony, not under the rubric of equality. Huh? So what I'm trying to say, the powerfulness of the divisive potential of nationalism might get mitigated, and is likely to get mitigated, because when you translate that right to national determination for two groups that are intertwined and entangled, that means the exclusive and the aggressive exclusiveness of the nature of nationalism in political terms will have to be compromised, precisely because the way you're going to cash out this in a specific reality of intertwinement is going to be actually non-statist. It's going to be a state, but not an exclusive ethnicized state. So I think this is a powerful claim to put forward. Now, I want to come to the second claim, which I think is also reasonable, but I want to concede to whoever asked this question to concede the point that this requires further elaboration and further inquiry. But let me just say the point, and the point is that, again, under the way we speak about binationalism under conditions of intertwinement, there is no attempt here to move into saying that actually nationalism is not risky. No, nationalism is risky, but there is a communitarian nature, which that communitarian nature that is likely to be attributed to the forms of nationalism, given the diversities of the groups that the Palestinians and the Israelis have, is likely to have a form of nationalism that is not heavily thick and robust. And therefore, the hope is that the political arrangement that will be created on top of an intertwined, entangled reality will lead to mechanisms and movements and travel of geographies and ethnicities and intermarriages, and also enclaved communities that might want to enclose themselves. But largely the cash out and the translation of that might be in a form of nationalism that is overall not too thick. But the concession that I want to make here is that I am not in a position to come and commit myself in answering this question in relation to this specific second point with a higher level of commitment about that there is a guarantee that this might not collapse into sectarianism of some sort. I think the risk is there. I don't have a fully sophisticated answer to that. I think the direction is to go to hope through different mechanisms of engagement, education, interactions between communities, that would be a thin form of nationalism, but not thin in the liberal sense, but thin in the communitarian sense. And it would, the geographies of engagement will create, given the entanglement and entwinement, will create mitigations and weakening any potential aggressive forms of sectarianism that might cash out into, balkanization or civil war or that type of thing. You are muted, my friend.
Again, always forget. Thank you very much. I guess that was the last question we've had from the students. Bashir, I'd just like to finish. I mean, there are several things that I could ask you to comment on, but there's just one thing that happened this week here at university, and I'd really love to hear your commentary on this. This week, everyone received an email from the Central Office for Academic Exchange regarding the central office, so it's not my faculty's office, it's the university's office for academic exchange, national and international. They have a whole huge space for what they call corners for different countries, spaces for different countries to put up stands, to put up their material, have activities, material, meetings, whatever they like. So up to now, it's new. This is rather new. Up to now, we have the Israeli corner, we have the Korea corner. I think that's basically what we have so far. The Israeli corner has been very active, and this week we received an email that they're going to have a cooking class, and they're going to teach people how to make an Israeli cooking class, an Israeli cooking class, and they're going to teach hummus, falafel, and tahini. So we're amidst a huge debate here this week because students are, they want to protest against this. They said, this is appropriation. So the Israeli corner, they can have their tea with Hebrew-speaking activities, but if they're going to teach Israeli cooking, why are they going to teach Arab food? No? So what would you say to our students regarding this polemic this week?
I don't really know the specificities of the context of your university and the setting within which this whole emerging controversy is coming. I don't know, which type of, also what is really controversial in there. But I can speak in general terms about, it's no news that Israel has been aggressive about its own kind of aspara and propaganda and pink washing, whitewashing, and maybe falafel washing now. I don't know. I'm creating a term now. I don't know if there's a falafel washing or whatever, hummus washing. But one of the most incredible things about Israel is this kind of cultural appropriation of Palestinian things, and I think you cannot really disconnect this from Israel attempt to indigenize itself in a way. So it's despite Israel's success, and the Israelis have remarkable achievements in different fields, in sciences and many other things, and they have managed, actually, Zionism has managed to revolutionize modern Jewish life. At a very high cost, that I think now more and more voices in the world Jewry that are becoming much more careful and much more aware about the price that this success has come at the expense of range of potentiality of being Jew. Who said that being Jew reduced to Jewish identity, Jewish Israeli identity? Might mean many things, and it meant many things. So I think so. Many other things that are involved in this. Part of Israel lack of security, and not lack of security in the literature, but lack of security in terms of that actually Zionism is a European movement that came to answer a European question and a European problem. Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky and Herzl, these are these are European citizens. They emerged in the context of European Christian hatred, anti-Semitism, and European national, kind of exclusionary form of things. And they try to answer a European question, which is Jewish question. It's not a Palestinian question. It's not an Arab question. It's not a Middle Eastern question. It's a European question. And therefore, the desire of the Israeli politics all the time to look for ways to have that intimacy and establish that familiarity with the space, with the language, while affirming and constituting the supremacy of being Europeans in the savage of the Middle East, and in that sense, villa in the jungle and all of that stuff, involve different mechanisms of trying to become natives. You are probably aware with the work of Mamdani about, settlers become natives, Because so there is this kind of issues of inferiority, and some Palestinians have published on this, including Raif and others, in relation to these types of issues. So I think this is the context within which we need to look at that. That kind of appropriation is a very serious invitation for looking. Actually, it's a very interesting invitation for looking at the settler colonial nature of the state of Israel and Zionism, without obviously overlooking the fact that actually part of normalizing Israel's presence in their eyes has been drawing these local affinities with the place. But this is one of the things. I started by saying that Zionism has revolutionized modern Jewish life through managing to create successfully a Jewish Israeli national identity. But it has failed miserably in two things. It miserably failed on normalizing Jewish Israeli lives, because in the eyes of the Palestinians, they are not legitimate. And obviously gaining legitimacy. There is no normalization and no legitimacy. They can normalize with Saudi Arabia if they want the day before. I hope they won, because I hope the Saudis will attach a huge political price for that to happen that will benefit the Palestinians. But even if they do, the eyes of the overwhelming majority of the Arabs, Israel has a very serious issue of normalcy, and let alone that in the eyes of its own victims, has a very serious issue of legitimacy, meaning in the eyes of the Palestinians. And therefore, I think this needs to be understood in these types of surface, popular type of culture. But of course, there is no doubt that, the makeup of the Israeli society is also constituted and made up of Mizrahi Jews and Arab Jews who have made and brought this kind of cuisine traditions with them from wherever they came from in the greater Middle East and Arab and Muslim Middle East. So, but the use and abuse of that is that actually Israel wants supposedly to come across as Middle Eastern, but doesn't miss any opportunity to remind everyone that they are part of the civilized West. And that civilized West actually casted the Jews as Semites and not white and not Aryan, and took them to concentration camps. And this is the double standards and the hypocrisy the Israeli government does with Hungary, Poland, and others, where these are disgustingly vulgar form of ethno-nationalism in these countries that actually flirt with some anti-Semitic kind of language, where these become allies of Israel in the EU and allies of Israel and Netanyahu, where there is this double standard of things. So I think if I can contribute to this, I think it needs to be tied to these kind of larger perspectives, and should look at cuisine as an instrument of propaganda and aspara. But again, this is not to sincerely not see that falafel is incredibly popular in Israel, and not to see that hummus is incredibly hummus. But the issue of fetishizing this and using that as a shallow identity politics of remaining at the level of folklore, without even attaching that to the Palestinians themselves. And and the Palestinians basically on the ruin of whom the state of Israel was built and is being built at the moment. And trying to familiarize yourself as if you are local. And Ben-Gurion, were saying, no, these Palestinians, these local indigenous people, they are basically the continuation of the Jews, these Falahim. So there is this kind of always this kind of ambivalent relationship. But I think using it and abusing it in this propaganda, white pink washing way is incredibly problematic. obviously, and this is not an invitation to overlook the diversity and the complexity of the Jewish political, demographic, cultural, and cuisine makeup of the Israelis, but in the way that it is presented, I think is really shallow and you know, I mean, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That'll be very interesting for this week for our students, and it's a huge debate. So, Rashid, thank you immensely for your great contribution, in-depth points, analysis, answering all the questions the students had. It's been great to have you here explaining to us this shift in paradigm in grammar and the different forms of the one state which exist, which are out there. So there are no more questions. Rashid, we'll finish a few minutes before, just as you had asked, also to be able to go to your next activity. And hoping to see you soon here in Brazil.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm gonna go for this thing in Ramallah now. So thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you. All the best to you too. Take care.
Bye bye. Good luck.
Bye bye.